it seems like we've got most of our people here. I know there's still a few more people, but well, if they're late, that's their fault. I know several of the faces out there, but for those of you that I don't know, I'm Justin Ferguson. I'm a solutions architect for Risk IQ here out in Shawnee. And I have been active with OWASP for quite a while, but OWASP has been pretty much dead for quite a while. So some of us got to talking about it, and we're going to try and bring it back this year. We're going to try and actually have some meetings, have some cool, interesting speakers, and make this something that people actually want to show up to, which is the important thing. So this is our high-level agenda. We're going to try and kind of make our meetings a little more structured than they have been previously. I'll spend a few minutes for those of you who don't know or haven't had the misfortune to be at one of our meetings before to talk about OWASP a little bit. And then we're going to run through just some AppSec news. We'll make a few introductions, and then I'm going to spend a few minutes try and spend a few minutes in each meeting talking about a specific OWASP project, just to kind of bring some attention to some of the things that OWASP as an organization does. And then after that, we have Arian Evans, who is our Risk IQ VP of Product, and he's going to talk. Arian's been actively involved with OWASP for a long time, has worked at White Hat and a number of other places, and he's going to talk a little bit about the risks of third-party software in your application. So it should be an interesting talk. Arian is usually pretty damn interesting. So we'll talk a little bit about OWASP and what it is first. I suspect that if most of you are here, you probably have an idea that OWASP is the Open Web Application Security Project. Otherwise, you might be in the wrong room. For a little more background, though, OWASP is a worldwide not-for-profit that basically their goal is to improve the security of software, specifically web applications. Their goal is to make software security something that people actually think about, bring awareness to it, and not just kind of that thing that you have to do to check off your checkbox on your PCI audit. So a little bit about OWASP. It has an international governance board with local chapters, and, well, that's kind of hard to read. There are a number of OWASP projects, which anyone can start an OWASP project. Some of those projects include things to do with tools, things to do with standards. They have encryption libraries and libraries for doing secure encoding. They have projects like the ASVS, which is the Application Security Verification Standard. That's sort of an overall standard for implementing an AppSec program. And a number of tools that can be used for both security professionals and developers. They make everything they do available under a free license, so there's no issues with using their open source code in your projects. They host conferences once a year, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And they do a podcast that I think comes out about monthly, I'm not sure. There's a $50 a year membership fee to be a member of the national organization, not required to show up to the local meetings. We appreciate it if you want to be a member of the national organization, because some portion of that membership cost comes to us, so we can do things like, maybe bring food to one of these meetings one of these days without having to rely on the kindness of a vendor. One of the other very important things about OWASP, and it may not be real obvious tonight since I work for Risk IQ, we have a Risk IQ speaker, and there's about 17 people back here with Risk IQ shirts on. OWASP does try to be a vendor agnostic organization and not favor any one vendor. The presentations that you see at OWASP meetings should not be sales presentations. We will try very, very hard to avoid that. So that's just kind of part of OWASP's core is we appreciate support from vendors, but we don't want we don't want vendor presentations because that's not what you all are here to see. This is the mission statement that I made up out of whole cloth for OWASP KC because we really haven't had a mission statement previously. But what I would like to see OWASP KC evolve into is a community not just for security people, but also for application developers who sometimes in their jobs kind of end up diametrically opposed with each other. I mean, I know I've worked with Mr. Grandall here previously, and we sort of butted heads a few times because we had different angles we were coming at things from. And so I want this to be a community where there can be open discussion and everybody can share each other's perspective. So that's my goal. Now, how are we going to do this? Well, that's a damn good question. We are going to try our darndest to have regular meetings, fourth Tuesday of every month, hopefully right here. I've got at least the next 3 months reserved. So great, big thanks to the Kauffman Foundation for making this space available to us for free. That's really awesome. We will try to have a speaker for most meetings. Sometimes those may be from a vendor, if we can get a vendor to come in and speak about technology and not sales. Sometimes it may be a round table. It could be, you know, me or Nathaniel or any one of you who is interested in speaking about an AppSec topic. You are all welcome to do that. We want it to be the community you guys make it. So we'll try and spend a little bit of time talking about some AppSec news, and if there's any news from the global OWASP organization, we'll talk about that. We'll spend a few minutes spotlighting an OWASP project, like I mentioned, and pretty much you're looking at it. Like I said, the meetings are open to everyone. We appreciate pre-registration simply so we can make sure that we have a big enough space for the number of people we have showing up, but it's not required, so we're probably good. You know, we may occasionally do a social meeting, meet somewhere at a bar with a larger area or a restaurant or something like that, just to change it up, but I'm going to try not to do those very often. Those will be the last ditch if I really can't get anybody to come speak. And like I said, we want presenters. So if you are a developer working on application security, or if you are an InfoSec person who has something really cool that you've been working on InfoSec-wise that's AppSec related, you know, as long as we can kind of tie it back somehow, talk to me. We've got lots of opportunities. We'd love to make this into something, a user-driven community. I hate to use that phrase. So real quick, like I said, I'm Justin Ferguson. I'm a volunteer chapter leader. I'm doing this because, well, I'm possibly not sane. But we also have Matt Cogran, who was the former chapter leader. Many of you have met him. He actually is working for Apple in California at this time, and so isn't in town a lot. And that's kind of why I'm taking over the scheduling of the meetings and things like that. That's why we really haven't had any meetings for a while. Nathaniel Cole back here has stepped up to kind of volunteer. And Chad Salisbury, who's one of my coworkers at Risk IQ, has also said he will probably help out here and there. So if any of you have any feedback, whatever else you might have, feel free to reach out to us and let us know. You know, if you've got a presentation idea or something you'd like to see, talk to us. So there's a lot of people in this room, but I'm gonna kind of do a quick around the room to let anybody who wants to do a shout out and say, hi, I'm such and such and I work at wherever, or if you don't want to, just wave on. But I'd kind of like to know who all we've got here. So we'll start over here in the corner, and feel free to pass if you don't want to talk.
I'm off that. I'm independent consultant.
Okay.
Application developer.
Okay. Nice to meet
Bruce
you.
Marshall. I do app security for Commerce Bank.
Okay.
I'm Steve Slater. I do information security for Swiss Re.
Okay.
Anthony Grandal. I'm a software security architect for Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco.
Mike White, I'm a security researcher for Risk IQ.
Matt King, I'm an account manager at Risk IQ, but background is IR and security.
Nathaniel Cole, do application security for Hallmark.
David Waldrop, I do information security at American Century, and I'm a recovering developer. So.
I know that feeling. There's a few of us.
Barry Archer, I'm in information security at American Century as well.
Elizabeth Wilson, I'm a developer for Commerce.
Taylor Henning, application security commerce.
Okay.
Stephanie White, developer at Balance Innovations. Co-worker over there.
Sharon Mel, I'm a intern at QCP&L Systems Engineering. I'm at DeVry getting my network communications management degree in a couple months.
Caleb Begging, security technology architect at CERN.
Joshua White, in between jobs right now.
You did a trainer for us at UMB at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was gonna bring that up to you, but
yeah, I remember your face.
Forget it for now. That's terrible.
Maria Myers, I am a programmer with a functional for data processing.
I'm Al Rosine. I work for CSRA, supporting the Marine Corps on the development of
Okay.
I'm Michael Heath, and I'm just interested.
Awesome.
My name is Matt Moyer. I'm a security engineer at an online bank called Simple.
Jeff Jones. I'm a pen tester at NIC here in the KC area.
Jace Ferguson. I am a web and software developer for the Independent School District.
Ian Cowger, I'm an analyst at Risk IQ.
Forrest Peterman, analyst for Risk IQ.
Aaron Piper, also just interested.
Hey, we like people who are just interested. They're the best victim.
I'm Mandy. I work at Risk IQ as well.
Patrick Larry, solutions architect for Risk IQ.
John Harper, I'm a QA analyst at Balance Innovations.
I'm Aaron, recovering hacker, part of the Risk IQ gang.
So, like I said, I'm not going to waste, because I've already kind of been through this, I'm not going to waste a lot of time on this slide, but again, we want this to be member driven. We want to make it, we know you guys have other things to do on Tuesday evenings. Well, maybe. I don't, but we want to make it worth your time to show up. So if you have something that you'd like to see at one of these meetings, either send me an email, address is right there, or join our mailing list and send an email to the mailing list, and we'll see if we can make it happen. If you've got a vendor you'd like to hear from, if you've got a topic you'd like to hear from, if you've got an OWASP project you'd like to know more about, we can accommodate that, but we need you guys to let us know. So we want to make this something you guys want to show up to and make it worth your time. So that's my 30-second, much longer than 30-second intro. So we're going to talk a little bit about AppSec news. Hopefully there will be no ninjas. So some upcoming events that some of you might be interested in attending. The Boulder and Denver OWASP chapters are going to be hosting the Front Range OWASP conference on February 18th in Denver. Registration's only $30, so if you've got, some time to drive out to Denver or hop on a cheap flight out there and spend a day, it's only a one-day conference, but it sounds like they've got some great speakers. I think they have Jeremiah Grossman speaking, among other people. So it seems like it would be a good expenditure of a day if you got $30 in travel fees. So RSA conference, the big thing, is coming up in the end of February in San Francisco. A little closer to home, we've got the Kansas City Developers Conference, June 22nd through 24th. If any of you want to think about submitting a paper about application security, call for papers closes February 12th. A new thing that well, it's not exactly a new thing, but I just kind of found out about it today because they reached out to me. Interface KC is a small one-day conference that will be occurring in Kansas City here on July 21st. They are offering, they use the phrase by invitation only, but it doesn't seem like it's terribly hard to get an invitation. But they are offering invites to anyone in OWASP KC who would like to go. So if you're somebody trying to keep up some CPE credits or things like that, it does count towards that, as does this meeting, just in case anybody's wants to keep track. So that's kind of a neat opportunity, and we'll probably have more about that as we get closer to the date. They're going to send me some information. If you're interested in that, I recommend you join the OWASP KC mailing list so that when I get more information, I'll send it out there. And then the last thing is the big yearly AppSec USA conference that OWASP holds every year will be October 11th through 14th in Washington, D.C. I went 2 years ago. I unfortunately didn't make it last year, but it's generally a very worthwhile conference.
It is. Yeah, it's good.
I've been in
So,
yeah.
and it's a good time. They do some good training associated with it, things like that. So I definitely, if you are the other nice thing is it's kind of later in the year, so sometimes budgets.
Yeah. And it's not just geared towards AppSec people. They have a lot of presentations that are directly geared towards developers and QA testers, and they try to hit the whole gamut of the development lifecycle.
Yeah, that's the thing about OWASP is, even based on the audience we have here, it's a cross it's a very large cross-platform or cross-functional organization as far as who is interested in the stuff. So that's the upcoming events. A few random news bits that I found amusing or interesting. So a couple weeks ago, Forbes magazine published a big article that a lot of people wanted to read, but they required users to disable ad blockers to read it. And then promptly, most of those users got infected with malware from bad advertising, which, that's always fun. OWASP has released a new edition of the ASVS standard, the Department of Redundancy Department. So I will be talking a little bit more about that, but it has gotten some good news coverage. Arcsan is a security firm who just did a State of Application Security in Healthcare Apps report, and their report found that 85% of mobile healthcare apps are vulnerable to at least 2 OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities, which just kind of shows the need for OWASP attention in a lot of different spaces. Mobile app development is still a kind of the Wild West in a lot of cases. So, Perception Point released a Linux kernel local to root vulnerability that affects pretty much all your Linux servers. So if you got servers that people have logins to, you might want to think about patching them. Your Android phones, well, you're pretty much screwed until your carrier updates them. And then the big news, Internet Explorer 8, 9, and 10 were end-of-lifed on January 12th, 2016, which means you can maybe get away with telling all those users who are using those ancient versions to upgrade, unless you work in a corporate environment and are still stuck on IE6, but I wouldn't know anything about that. So, so then our project spotlight, like I mentioned, we're going to spend just a few minutes on an OWASP project in each of our meetings. So if there's a specific project that you want to hear about, let me know. I'll make something up about it. So tonight we're going to talk about ASVS, which is the Application Security Verification Standard. It is one of OWASP's what they call flagship projects, along with the OWASP Top 10 and the ZAP Proxy, which are 2 of my favorite OWASP projects. They just did a major release of it in October. So basically what the ASVS is it's a resource for implementing secure software development lifecycle. It kind of comes at things from a lot of different angles. It tries to tie a lot of the functions within a large organization together into one process to implement a secure SDLC. Its main goals are helping organizations create secure applications and continue to keep their applications secure. In that sense, it can act as either a metric for how good a job you're doing at that, or guidance on how to get there. And then to allow basically all of the people involved in the security industry to kind of all talk the same language, so to speak. And in that sense, it can be used as an industry baseline. So it's a pretty valuable thing especially if you're a newer company or a company newer to secure software development. It is actually used by several other OWASP projects as part of their development life cycle, which is kind of cool because, you know, it's OWASP eating its own dog food, so to speak. It basically defines 3 levels of security verification. Level 1 is just kind of the stuff that everybody really ought to be doing, and if you're not doing it, you're probably doing it wrong. Level 2 is standard for applications that contain sensitive data. And then level 3 is for the really critical applications. They actually use the phrase applications which might have a life or death connection to them. And then things containing sensitive financial data, etc. And for each of those levels, they provide some industry-specific recommendations per market segment. So, well, this thing doesn't work. No lasers for me. So, for example, this is just a segment of the finance and insurance industry, and it basically just gives an idea of what some of the threat profiles are for that industry, and then says which types of applications within that industry each of these levels applies to. So the first one is just any application which is on the network. Level 2 is applications that contain sensitive information like credit card numbers, personal information, or that can move limited amounts of money. And then level 3 is the ones that can move a lot of money or have highly sensitive information in them. Now, some of those seem pretty obvious, but it also provides case studies and guidance for the utilization of the ASVS, which are really kind of interesting. And then a detailed set of objectives for each of those levels. So, you know, it shows the first one down here is verify that all application components are identified and known to be needed. That's across the board. But then when you get down to 1.4, you have to verify that all application components are defined in terms of business functions contained within. Well, that's that you don't need to do for just the basic ones, but once you get up in the more advanced ones, it gets to be important. The ASVS also heavily references other OWASP projects like the Top 10, the testing guide, code review. You know, a lot of the OWASP projects are really sort of guides to how to implement application security, so the ASVS is kind of tying all those together and how to implement them. And then one of the interesting parts for those of you who might have to deal with such painful things, it provides mappings between PCI and the recommendations that are in ASVS. So, should you have to deal with ugly things like PCI, it can be a good resource for creating an SDLC that influences PCI compliance. So that's sort of the high-level view of ASVS. If you've got any questions about it, I could try to answer them, or you can go to the website, the OWASP website, and it's fairly prominently featured in the projects. So I recommend if you're trying to implement a secure SDLC at your workplace, that it's an excellent resource to take a look at. And that's the end of me talking. So now we're going to get Arian up here. Arian is the VP, like I said, the VP of Product Strategy at Risk IQ. He's worked at Fishnet, at White Hat, and done a whole lot of other cool things for 3-letter acronyms, and probably done some things to 3-letter acronyms. So we're going to let you have it here.
Sweet. See how quickly we can put people to sleep. It's nap time. Cool. We're going to talk about a couple subjects tonight that may seem unrelated at first, but I promise we will. That's why they're not really around anymore. Great place to learn a lot about security, though, because you're recording this. Ooh, I've got to be careful here. It was a great place to learn a lot about security, and then there were no books on AppSec and software security. That's pretty interesting. The early days were like Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. And so I got to meet the Russians and then the Ukrainians, and then I got to meet the FBI. This is pre 9/11, so Secret Service was still part of the Treasury Department. So I got to meet the Secret Service and then FinCEN and all these lovely people. And advice back then in the day, you get on these calls, they'd be like, hey, well, you're getting hacked. The problem is you're running IIS. You need to change your web server to Apache. And I'd be like, that's not really what's going on here. They're injecting Transact SQL code into your database because your parameters are all smashed into strings. And nobody understood what that meant. SANS would get on these calls, and even the SANS instructors were just out to lunch. And so OWASP was founded. I wound up joining Fishnet because Fishnet Security had landed 2 contracts to do AppSec, early 2000, I don't know, 2001, something like this. And one they had to give the money back because it was web services, and they had some scanner jockey people. Fishnet was mostly infrastructure in the very beginning, and they were running Nessus, and there's not a lot to scan with Nessus on a web service. So the customer got really frustrated because they realized they didn't understand what a web service was, and the other contract was really big. Fishnet didn't want to give back the money, so I joined them to build out their AppSec practice. And OWASP was founded around the same time by some guys I'd met through the Black Hat security conferences online. We would share exploits and things. One of them was Jeremiah Grossman, you mentioned, and White Hat Security actually founded OWASP with a few others. The history's been pretty revisionist. It's a very political organization. It's all calmed down today because everybody grew up. But when OWASP was first founded, it was predominantly people from White Hat and people from what was AppScan? It was Perfecto, and then Sanctum Security. Some of you remember. And then folks came in that predominantly ran consultancies, doing AppSec consulting, and that's where the anti-vendor charter came out in OWASP. And for a while, you couldn't even present with the vendor logo or anything. You'd get bashed on forums, and it was strictly because there was a different product promotional. And so another group spun off called WASC, which is kind of dead in the water now, but WASC was where all the product vendors, all the scanner and web app firewall vendors went to WASC, and all the consultants stayed at OWASP. And part of the reason it was anti-product was actually for a good reason. I was very empathetic in the early years, because in the early years, the web app firewall vendors are probably the worst about it. They would make all these magic claims for things the product did. Fishnet back in the day, I used to call them, they were sold with a magic elf inside. Somehow it would learn your software and auto-configure rules to protect it. Turns out the magic elf wasn't very bright, but we've evolved a lot since the early days. And so what fell out of this, we came up with a taxonomy at OWASP. It made a lot of sense. It helped us sort out kind of our content and direction. It's been one of those organizations that was led initially by cult of personality, and some of the projects has stalled out. Now there's like a whole new generation of community, people with real software development backgrounds in OWASP, so it's kind of exciting to see this new break of it. So a guy named Michael Coates, who's now the CISO at Twitter, actually came from the OWASP community, and Michael came up with this builder, breaker, defender taxonomy, which makes a lot of sense for the way to approach InfoSec. I started as a builder and then wound up as a breaker as I was learning what the Russians and Ukrainians were doing in my software. I found out I love reverse engineering. I've published like 3 O-days in .NET. Back in the early days, bar was really low. OWASP has shifted to focus more on the builder community, and that's a great thing. And so it's good to see software developers here. The whole secure coding kind of theme and mantra for OWASP. WASC is another organization to look at for content. The projects are mostly stale and dead. All the vendors are now billion-dollar corporations or absorbed into cent-a-billion-dollar corporations, and so the people who initially powered it are all pretty much gone. But the reason why it's important is if you're testing software and pen testing, the taxonomy at WASC is much smarter than OWASP. OWASP is a taxonomy for how to think categorically about building software. It's kind of where the top 10 has evolved, but it's not a very good taxonomy for testing or auditing software. Now, the third category, Defender, traditionally these were kind of our firewall jockeys, you know, and in the old days, these were the traffic cops, or I called them the Gandalf kind of security people, the thou shalt not pass. They gleefully delight in telling the business no. And that kind of mode of operation is pretty much dead. Those people as CISOs are getting blown out of the water. If they still have a job, it's probably not for long. You know, those kind of people are moved back into Unix administration roles. And we've kind of, security has had to evolve, as most of you are probably aware, with working in lockstep with the business. And that's part of what we're going to talk about tonight. Because the speed of which the business is evolving and making decisions, I believe, has outstripped a lot of the traditional models by which we approach security. And I think even some of what we preach, some of what parts of the OWASP community preaches might work in some parts of banking and insurance, but it does not work in the larger industry. It doesn't work in retail. It doesn't work where we're headed as a way of doing business on the internet. And so we'll talk about a little bit of that tonight. So the Defender category has actually evolved as well. The Defender category used to be kind of where I thought the less skilled folks went. The folks who want 4 radio button options to make a decision. People who don't understand how to read and write code. And that's no longer the case anymore. The Defender, the newest subcategory, which you'll probably hear Gartner and all the pundits talk about more this year, is the category of a hunter. And you have very intelligent, highly skilled people that are on what are now being named hunt teams. These have been around for years at more mature financial institutions, but now a lot of people are building hunt teams. And what is a hunt team? It's understanding what your adversaries are doing. It's understanding what they're setting up and planning and how they're going to attack you. So it's very important to build secure software. But if we go out to build a secure car or a secure bridge, we understand the threat landscape. We understand how much traffic do we want to model and how much weight is going to go over that bridge. And we don't have that luxury when we build software on the internet. You know, when we build cars, Chris Wysopal at Veracode and I used to talk about this a lot on the old secure coding forums. You know, there's specific models around how to build an airplane, and you have a lot of testing, you have fault injection analysis. Same with the car. We crash cars. That's how we got airbags. We built crash test dummies. We measured how people get injured. We actively crashed cars, no different than pen testing. You know, and we learned this, but we had very controlled, contained environments. We're going to build a car in a similar way for a decade. There's this long return on reuse of components and safety infrastructure that's very unlike what we're doing in software. So there's this shift, and the reason I put secret is there's ISOI and ISOI APT. There's a couple public conferences. There's First Cert that's in Seoul this year. There's a handful of conferences where you can go to that'll have the hunt team folks, but the main community for the hunt teams is secret today. If you're part of it, you're not. It's like Fight Club. You're not even allowed to mention the name of that particular organization. It's an invite-only thing. And the reason why is because once you get into the game of hunting adversaries, is you don't want to let the adversaries know what's going on and how you're hunting them down. As soon as you tip a hand, they just pivot around and do something new, which is what we'll talk about a little bit tonight. So OWASP started out as raising awareness, actually. The first top 10 it really started, I think, as response to, you know, if you look at the timeline for OWASP, it really kicked into gear right after Egghead went down. Does anybody remember Egghead? A lot of the room looks a lot younger than me. Okay. Egghead, Amazon bought the properties, and Newegg came later. I loved Egghead because they controlled all their parameters through cookies. So being a web hacker in the early days, people thought you were really smart. The bar was so low. The secret of my career success is going where the bar is really low. So, you know, you could go in. I might have gotten a ViewSonic Pro monitor for really cheap once, and so Egghead got hacked for the tune of something like $3.7 million in upfront cash, and then went on beyond that. It bankrupted the company. It was one of the first major impacts from hacking, and so all spun up as awareness, and then people responded by, I have firewalls. You know, and I'll lock down my firewalls. And some of you probably remember this. There was back in the day, all your IM clients had a port scanner in them. So they'd port scan, they'd find egress, and then they would launch their ridiculous proprietary protocol to tunnel out so you could instant message with your friends. And the Gandalf security people kept saying, thou shalt not pass, and they'd lock down all the firewalls. And so any of you who are developers, if you were around in the early web days, I was one of these. We're actually guilty, I think, for what actually happened to create this security nightmare, because any enterprising developer, what we did is just said, well, I'll tunnel everything over HTTP. Because that's the one thing they're going to leave open on egress, security guys. And the security guys are like, oh, Checkpoint has this new AI, this is HTTP protocol inspection. And it's like, what do? You wrap it in SSL. Take that, security guys. Snort can't see it, firewall can't see it. So we tunneled everything through SSL everywhere, over HTTP. Not very smart protocol, not very efficient, but it got the pesky firewalls out of the way. And so that's the reason why everything on the planet runs over HTTP through an SSL wrapper, is because it was the only thing the security people would let us do, which also subverted a whole ton of our security controls by lack of visibility. So we kind of spread awareness of what was going on there, and then eventually we published some content. I wrote some of the web hacking exposed books, which are really awful, and hopefully you've got Marcus and Daff write the Web Hacker's Handbook. I think it's on 2nd edition. That should be your Bible if you're doing any testing. Burp Proxy, Zap. And then now OWASP is focused on the actual art and sort of science, mostly art, of writing and building secure code. We're not going to talk about writing and building secure code tonight, though. So we're going to talk about vendors, even though that's sort of rubs against OWASP charter, but I helped write the anti-vendor charter, so I don't feel bad breaking it. Builders, breakers, and defenders. Risk IQ, the whole purpose behind our company was we set out to study the bad guys. So we were seeing some changes in the industry, and not enough things were studying where are they going to move to. We see the bad guys constantly pivot and try new things. So is there anything to be gleaned from there? And actually, in the very beginning, Lou, our CEO, wanted to see if there was a way to automate risk scoring by data that we could gather by what attackers are doing, data around assets and properties. Anybody who's ever probably dealt with running a large-scale InfoSec program and tried to build a product or work with clunky GRCs has probably indulged in the fantasy of automated risk scoring. It sounds awesome, if you've dabbled in Octave and FAIR and all that. It's a really cool idea, and it just kind of doesn't work. It's either you have a tolerance for a huge wide variance of fuzzy gray area to the point where it's like specious to me at best if it's actually a valuable risk score, or you're kind of making up numbers, and there's a lot of this in the wind. FAIR kind of embraces that and tries to make it sound scientific. What we did learn, though, is that a lot of data we could gather from applications and infrastructure and what adversary activities are doing could give us context to add to making decisions about other things. And I won't go into all of that tonight, but essentially, if you've got network sensors that generate an alert, maybe a user picked up a piece of malware, or maybe, whatever your snort rule triggers, is there a way that you can go collect information in real time to add context to that to make a decision without having a SOC analyst go research it, or having your managed service provider send you a report telling you they spent 8 hours researching something with the junior that's probably the results are irrelevant? Can we enable defenders, these people who traditionally do the firewalls and struggled with web app firewalls? How many people in here have successfully run web app firewalls in blocking mode? I mean, I know of at least one bank here that's been pretty darn successful at that, but very few. Banks and insurance tend to be able to pull it off because the applications tend to be a bit more static. Actually, some of the larger banks have given up. But once you get into people with really volatile development cycles, by and large, the industry has given up on blocking mode. They use them just as network sensors. I mean, the project, I know there's a big technology company you've probably all heard of. I won't say the name. I call them the cult of Cupertino. They had a project to roll out web app firewalls in blocking mode that went on for a good year and a half. They had to pull one of their top security engineers in the entire company to try to get the project back on track, and he finally said, I will quit, if you don't pull me off this thing. And so they're tough to manage. So is there a way we can take some of this data, though, and get more proactive about doing things instead of blocking one-to-one relationships? So that was kind of what we set out to do. And from this came a concept, I might refer to this again later tonight. We call it ADF, or Adversarial Digital Footprint. You map out your own attack surface. Some of you, when you test an individual app, we map out attack surface in terms of input in the UI and what methods and functions are exposed from the web service itself. And then as an enterprise, we try to map that out, which is getting harder and harder as an enterprise because your marketing teams and developers are spinning stuff up all over the place. One of you right now probably has a somewhere in your organization has a marketing team that has a promotional and needs to go live Friday, and IT said we don't have the resources to host that anywhere. And marketing says, hey, that's not a problem. We'll call back the creative consultancy that's building our creatives, and we'll pick option number 2 where they're hosted on WordPress. And they told us we just set our stopwatch till it's compromised. And then they'll call InfoSec back and go, hey, this new site got popped. And they're like, I don't even know where it is. We don't know what you're talking about. So these kind of things go on. Mapping out and maintaining infrastructure is important. But what we found from this is mapping out the adversary's infrastructure is actually just as important. And we'll come back to that later. So what's new and interesting in the SDLC? Working especially with a lot of technology-focused and driven companies. And actually, that's probably the wrong way to put it. If you look at revenue last year, there's 2 types of transactions that are interesting to us. There's informational transactions with sensitive information. There's transactions that our business revenue flows through. And if you look at the data last year, we saw over a 50% increase in digital channels, web, mobile, and social media. And over 70% of holiday purchases in North America were driven through digital channels, either directly or influenced by them. So web, mobile, or social media were the forms at which people made their decisions, if not outright spent, the money flowed through them. And the interesting thing about these digital channels is they're fairly complex, they're distributed, they increasingly, for most organizations, move outside our controlled firewalls and perimeters. And the first common part of this new landscape of digital channels that we have are third-party connections. Everybody has them. Most people became painfully aware of them during Heartbleed paranoia. Everybody's connected to everybody else. And so in the case of Heartbleed, if you're sharing information with someone and you patch up your end, but they don't patch up their end, your data has the exact same exposure. Your risk profile, I don't know how you factor that in. That's a challenging one. Did you reduce your risk at all patching your end? Can you really say you reduce your risk without killing that connection? What if your data is still at rest on the other side? And we don't really have tools and ways to manage this. It's certainly not part of the modeling that I see. And most people, if they have some form of threat modeling in the SDLC, by the time they get to the third party, it turns into a static checklist. It's a once for the entire relationship of the third party, or if they're lucky, a once a year Polaroid snapshot that goes in a drawer somewhere. And if something bad happens, you pull out that Polaroid from your dusty shoebox of third-party vendor audits, and it's absolutely useless to figure out what just happened in that scenario. Eloqua is a great example. How many of you are using Eloqua as part of your software or your campaigns? Okay, so I bet there's more folks in the room using Eloqua. They're one of the 2 big giants that people who use Salesforce use to run their marketing lead gen campaigns. People often plug them into their website, so your data comes into you, but not really. It makes a round trip to Eloqua, and then it comes back to you through your front end or through your back end. And so Eloqua plays kind of dirty. They write code to fake out scanners, so you can't find vulnerabilities if you try to vuln scan them. And I know this. We use them at White Hat, and the reason I know a little bit about their games is they got hacked, and people contacted us because they thought they hacked us because they were connecting to our front end, but they actually hacked into Eloqua. And then that's when we figured out they were blocking our ability to scan and test them and all that. But the interesting thing is they had a lot of our data. It looked just as bad. The people who found this stuff were going to dump the data saying, oh, we hacked White Hat, look at this data we got. Because they initially touched on the whitehatsec.com landing page. But it's still really kind of the same problem if they're holding, in this case, luckily they didn't have a lot of sensitive data. But you can go through the kind of connections you have, and certainly this problem is growing. The one that we've seen the most of this year is the rise in CDNs, and obviously it's cloudy everywhere as far as hosting. What we find that's fascinating, though, is most security organizations we talk to usually have a pretty, well, they're either really paranoid and think the situation's bad, and they're usually right, or they have a naive assumption that they have a pretty good handle on how much stuff is on third-party CDNs and in the cloud. And we consistently find it's usually at least 30% greater than what they realize. And because a lot of these things, if they bypass IT, then they don't even get in a potential function to notify InfoSec. So IT doesn't even know about all the things that get spooled up out there. I could list some of the biggest internet giants that B2B that I know probably everybody in this room at some point is doing business with or has done business with. And one got compromised twice last year, and the breaches were by things that marketing set up, very high-profile campaigns involving PII that nobody in InfoSec even knew about them to go look at.
And this makes sense because these new CDNs, these Akamai competitors and all this, what's that new CDN that got breached last year by the Syrian Electronic Army? They've raised like $65 million in funding. There's some new, very disruptive CDN. They're super cheap. It's not Cloudflare. They're cheaper than Cloudflare. They're super fast. Makes sense to business. You got cheap, you got high performance, easy to move your code over. They didn't even have any security staff. They had like no security people. They've got a lot of money. They're moving quickly, and luckily they only were breached repeatedly by hacktivists. But essentially, the people who broke into them got access to, I believe it was 1,062 different businesses, all their web properties and the content that was hosted on them. Where this gets worse, I suppose, or more interesting, where our secure development lifecycle starts to break down conceptually in the traditional SDLC is when we start combining this with third-party libraries, and specifically I mean client-side libraries, the vast majority of which are JavaScript. And if you look at the composition of modern web apps today, a huge part of the code footprint is client-side JavaScript. How many of you are running Gigya today? So 75% of the Alexa 20,000 is running Gigya, over 75%. So you're probably running Gigya today, and you probably don't know it. Gigya, if you're not familiar with them, they're the login as Facebook or Twitter people. So anytime you see a site, and so they sell straight to the businesses. They bypass IT. And the business owner loves it. So they say, hey, drop in this library. Actually, you can host this on third parties. You don't have to drop anything in. Just have someone make a connection and subvert your authentication and any controls you have in your app. Let us log in and we'll pass back an authenticated state to you, and we'll give you more info about your users than you had before. Well, of course they will. They also get a lot of info about your users that they turn around and sell to other people. So they just get to print money by being linked into them. Now what's scary about Gig is they also got hacked. Their CDN got taken over, and their library got swapped out. And we were the first folks that detected it and were able to help people shut it down pretty quickly, but a whole lot of people were serving up dynamically loaded content on the fly, you know, from called in, sourced in within their own domain from Gigya to have absolutely no idea because they didn't even know they're running Gigya. And then when the CISO finds out and goes and asks the team, you know, first place they go is the red team. Red team's like, okay, well, you know, we've got some perimeter-based scans, some web scans, but half the stuff running Gigya, it could be in Amazon, could be on Cloudflare, who knows where all it is, right? How do you quickly search and query and figure that out? It's a tough question. I want to ask about jQuery. You get the point. They were compromised last year, and the attackers that looked to us like they were working their way over the CDN. jQuery's own website was compromised for a week or two. And they were aggressively in denial about it because it was all memory resident stuff. The attackers got pretty sophisticated, so they had all their tripwire file system stuff running, and they were adamant that nobody's made any changes to our file system. We're not hacked, and they were absolutely true. Nobody made any changes to their file system. Because they just kept popping them over and over again with memory resident exploits. How many of you are running New Relic? New Relic's awesome. I mean, performance management and monitoring software used to be kind of a cumbersome nightmare. Very expensive, kind of needed a DBA to handle the back end of the thing, and you bought this huge Avalanche system for hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you know, now you can get it really, really cheap. And so there's a very large internet property that sales organizations like to use. And I noticed about a year and a half ago, they were running New Relic. And so I went to the CISO and I said, hey, I'm curious the profile for this. So New Relic, if you're not familiar, it's performance monitoring software, you know, and you can drop it in and run that thing inside the browser. But essentially at this point, you're running third-party code inside the DOM that's essentially a data funnel back to New Relic. So if New Relic has a bug in it, or you misconfigure it, or something goes wrong, you know, you've got a hose and a funnel hooked right up into the DOM of your web session, and they could suck out anything they wanted. Or if an attacker subverts it, you know, it's already pre-owned from that perspective. So there's a certain amount of risk and profiling associated with that, and I just don't see very many organizations accounting for that in their SDLC. Absolutely not accounting for it all in their monitoring. I mean, what are you going to do with the WAF with that? What are you going to do with that in an annual pen test? You know, it's a case where you need a security camera and ongoing monitoring. That's the only way you can detect and respond to issues with a situation like that. Probably also monitoring a third party. Well, the New Relic one was interesting because I asked the CISO what risk profiling they'd done, and he said that if I were to talk to the organization, he said probably 80-90% of the organization doesn't know what New Relic is. And of the remaining percentage of the organization, he was fairly confident that 99% of them had no idea it was running in production. So this SaaS giant, one of the biggest on the internet, somebody had dropped New Relic in, running through the full session. And I noticed about a week after I had that conversation with him, it was running unauthenticated only. So it's no longer in the logged in user sessions, which is probably a wise decision. But just little things to keep in mind. So the world we live in has changed fairly significantly. And we've got these very rich DOMs, and the bad guys know that. And so they're looking for ways to hack into this. You know, it's getting harder to find unauthenticated verbose SQL injection. You know, it used to be that was pretty trivial to find, but you know, from February to April 2007, we saw the rise of SQL injection bots, and that year through there in 2008, everybody got a free pen test unauthenticated for SQL injections. So, you know, that kind of took care of itself. You know, there was back in the White Hat days, you know, in the early days of White Hat was 90. We started out as 90-some% of websites would be vulnerable to cross-site scripting. And then it was 80, then it was 70. Some of these things go away and change with time, some don't. Authentication issues. Everybody used to roll their own. Now with the advent of modern frameworks, authentication issues are largely gone away. Authorization issues haven't really changed at all in the last decade in percentage and frequency of occurrence. What has changed is people now load anywhere from a dozen to dozens of libraries on the average web app of third-party code that are sourced in dynamically from other CDNs and other hosting providers. And when I talk to them about their security model, they don't have anything in their security model to account for how to audit those libraries. I mean, what are we going to do with them? We're not going to run source code scanners on them. They're JavaScript. We certainly can't run a source code scanner that has any context to what it means to run inside the DOM. The dynamic scanners are struggling with it. Depending on the complexity of the JS, a few of the dynamic scanners can sort of build a DOM, but largely they kind of struggle with that. And you know, the third-party thing, you probably recognize a lot of these names, but all these people, Akamai is actually one of the best at doing security, but all these others have had a number of issues. Last year, a whole bunch of them on this list were compromised repeatedly, and everybody was running them. They just don't know where. So, bottom line, real-time third-party libraries are a new concept and how we develop software. They can change in an instant, and we have no control over that. Or we could have some controls. There's ways we could check some and do things, but very few organizations have technology and process in place to have controls and alerting around how we handle third-party libraries. If they have anything at all, I call it the Polaroid security program. They take a snapshot once a year or once when they onboard a new vendor and shove it in an electronic drawer somewhere, and it's pretty much worthless. Our SaaS doesn't work. The DAST engines range between very limited in functionality. Sorry if you're not acronym friendly. SAST is source code scanning. It's static application security testing, source or binary scanning. The SAST vendors have largely not been able to deal with JavaScript. The DAST vendors, the problem is there's no innovation in the DAST or the dynamic scanning space. Patents have effectively killed innovation. That's why there's no new startups in that space. And so you have a handful of giants. They've all been bought by big companies, or they've kind of stagnated in that mid-sized growth, and their engines are antiquated, so they don't build a proper DOM and parse and manipulate JavaScript like you'd need to. They hide humans behind a curtain to try to augment it. So maybe you get something decent once as part of onboarding, but there's no ongoing capability. So what do we see attackers doing? Let me switch gears here. All right, so we're going to talk about what we see changing in terms of threats as a result of this. So one of the cool things that we're seeing is the same technology that's enabled us as developers to satiate the business's need for speed and competitive advantage and releasing new features. All the same things from DevOps tools, automatic replication build. The bad guys are using all the same things as well. We've noticed this in what we call the rogue app world, which some of you have probably heard the term phishing. It used to be that a phishing site would set off your spidey senses because it looked like an ESLE site. English is a second language. Looked like it was hosted on GeoCities. It's kind of like your mom might click it, but you kind of knew better. And that's not how rogue apps look today. Rogue apps are a perfect copy. We have people who have dev and replication tools set up that they're automatically replicating. So we have banks that we're working with that in near real time, in sub 15 minutes, if they make any changes to anything, they can completely rebuild the DOM with new JavaScript. It's all replicated in real time and rebuilt, so their sites are a perfect copy. The same thing is happening in mobile now. The apps they use, they're doing one of two things. They're either building new fake applications that are more functional than the legitimate ones. We've seen that with some orgs in the Midwest that first went and dabbled in mobile. Same thing happened in Europe. People would dabble in mobile, and the adversaries would be like, oh, I can build a better mobile app than that. Or they take the legitimate mobile app and just rewrap it. ArcSand that was mentioned earlier did that study. That's their whole thing, is protecting your app. ArcSand and Blue Box try to protect your apps from being just simply rewrapped. They use cloud hosting. They're using it at large scale now to do traffic redirection and confusion. They're making it very hard for your sensor technologies to really figure out where things are going, because they'll build a very rich DOM and start bouncing around. And we'll look at an example at the very end of this presentation of how they reroute your traffic. But it's really to throw off your automated detection and sensor technologies, and also to make a nightmare for the analysts who go back and try to research this. TDS is the term traffic direction services. These are the infrastructure they build to reroute and obfuscate. And it's cheap and easy for them to spool up new sites. So the three things we've seen as emergent threats: phishing, this old email, you click on a link and go to a website, that's evolved into a new, bigger concept of rogue apps and rogue profiles. When I say rogue app, it could be a profile on social media. Social media, web, mobile is all the same. Adversaries go out and make exact copycats of everything that your organization owns in terms of assets. We've seen the biggest growth in the last probably 6 months actually on social media, and we speculate it's because you have so many users concentrated. Twitter, last I looked, at 320 million active users. So you have this concentration of users, but you have a lot of context. You can easily scrape images, profile pictures, context about a user, verbiage they typically use, and they can automate repackaging and distributing that to make it look very realistic. So it's a great place to go to look real. Mobile, people have been rewrapping and publishing apps. Most people don't realize how screwed up the mobile ecosystem is. A given app can have hundreds or thousands of copycat apps in stores around the world. It's a huge mess, but the impact has not been as great yet in mobile. I mean, the shift is definitely coming as we move towards a mobile world, but the threats haven't materialized quite as much as we're seeing more impact faster on social media, and I think it's because of the concentration of users. Domain shadowing. As we build more and more complex infrastructure and get into cloud hosting and all that, another thing, we'll be publishing a paper on this pretty soon, but we've been studying, same thing, if you're familiar with Bishop Fox, they're kind of a high-end pen test consultancy by some ex-NSA folks. They talked about this last year at Black Hat. We find a lot of organizations that wind up with DNS entries that wind up tied and registered to assets in cloud or various hosting services that get orphaned, and they might still have links or be called in on a site, and the adversaries will wait and look for that stuff, and if something gets unregistered, or if they can get a node that's tied to an IP address that you still have orphaned child DNS bound to in the cloud, which happens surprisingly regularly. So you have this ads.whatever bound to this IP address in Amazon, and then somebody else can get a node on there and set up content that you'll source in. They essentially insert themselves into your software by getting a hold of these orphan pieces of your infrastructure. And then the last one is malvertising. And malvertising kind of seems tangential. It's essentially malware attacks over the advertising network. And the reason we think it's part of the picture is, we've always kind of had online ads, but online ads are paying the bills for most of the apps that we're using every day. The newest studies say we spend 1 hour and 45 minutes a day using some form of free software on the internet in North America, and that's all powered by ads. And the ads have the same interesting emergent behaviors as these third-party dynamically loaded libraries. It's just another interesting distributed platform that is essentially injecting arbitrary code into your applications at runtime that we don't really have good controls over. We could put checksumming and other things in place, and then all across the bottom of this they use traffic direction services. So let's talk about that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to talk a little bit about malvertising. I'm going to talk about the top things we see going on, the attacks in the malvertising world, and then at the very end I'll dig in under the hood and give you an example of both the advertising ecosystem and then how the attackers use these traffic direction services to reroute and obfuscate traffic. And if you have more questions, I can certainly show you more afterwards, but I don't want to bore everyone here at this time of the evening. What are we, 7:30? Oh, time check.
36. Yeah, you got 7:36. We got until 8.
Okay, cool. So when we set out to study, we at Risk IQ, we operate this globally distributed network. It's covert. We have to be covert so the adversaries don't know who we are. Does anybody remember Dascient, the malware scanner? Started by a bunch of Google PhDs, got bought by Twitter. Okay, there used to be a malware scanner. Qualys has a malware scanner now. And the name of the company was Dascient, and they suffered one condition early on that was, it's a classic PhD syndrome. Dascient was scanning websites for malware, and Dascient announced everywhere they went and scanned that, hi, we're Dascient, we're here to scan you. And surprisingly, it didn't take the bad guys long to figure out that if you see somebody show up and say, I'm Dascient, maybe you shouldn't serve up the malware to them. And so that's pretty trivial. So the bad guys today, they look for anything that looks like a good guy or a scanning service or something like that. So we have to operate this covert proxy network. We also have to run real browsers. We've got to build a real DOM and interact with it, and we built software to emulate users. And I lay this out so you get a context of how we're collecting this data. So we're monitoring, we hit about 13 billion landing pages a day. We're processing literally terabytes of web data a day that we're monitoring, running browsers, across the Alexa, top 100,000, across all our customer websites, across sites that we find of interest, then what they link to. Collecting this data, we started looking at abuses in the ad networks, and this is kind of tricky because you've got to be there when bad things happen. Like, you got to be there scanning all the time, because the malvertising stuff tends to be targeted, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So we're going to go through my mistaken assumptions, the overview in the study we did, some of the delivery methods, and then we'll go through some examples. So going into this, having been on the breaker side for so long, I helped build most of the technology the White Hat Security has on the dynamic and brought in the static acquisition and integrating them, and through that and being in the Valley, I got to work with a lot of interesting security teams. So I got to work with some of the Google folks when Aurora and Shady Rat happened, if you remember those. Those were APT penetrations, essentially. They all start with phishing deep in the networks, and then the Google one, they used that. They broke into 34, 36 other major companies. There's a lot of stuff that wasn't published about that. They got the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter plane blueprints. They got into Intel. It's pretty interesting. So very sophisticated targeted stuff, and that's what I assumed was what we were going to find going into this. I also thought when we looked at some of the ad stuff going through the mobile networks, we'd find similar stuff. And really, I thought mobile would all be about malware and excessive privileges. And I thought the ad attacks were going to be basically brute force, stupid. The things that we would see that would be obvious and visible would be like the, add more cat picture signature malware that your mom's probably downloaded, that gets on our machine. That's essentially spyware that we've all had to clean off. So anyway, that actually wasn't the case. So what we found is that the majority of attacks were actually pretty vast and varied. There were a lot of low-tech stuff, but the cat, ad thing was probably the least of it. We found that the mobile landscape is huge and similar to malvertising. I'm not going to go into that one now, but basically mobile wasn't about privileges and malware. Malware is the least of the problem in mobile. You might have, for a given brand, a couple apps with malware in them, but there might be 674 just straight up copycat apps. Like, you don't need malware when you get a user to download and give you their creds to log into their bank account, or you make a fake mint.com aggregator and get multiple bank accounts. Like, it's completely trivial, and the bad guys are actually really smart about how they go about this. PHI, we learned, that's a great target. I think most of the erectile dysfunction drug makers will pay up to $20 a record for males demographic like 45 to 75. It's like a gold mine out there. And there's some other target areas where you can make a lot, like a credit card. What is it today? It's pennies on the dollar for a day-old credit card, and yet you can get anywhere from $7 to $20 a record for some of these targeted marketing things. Eurograbber people made 47 million. So basically, malvertising attacks are getting increasingly sophisticated, and the reason why is because if I really want to increase my odds of success, I could make some special Corvette owner's application or Cadillac owner's application. And if I know my target demographic that has money that'll buy the goods, the group I know how to exploit is white Caucasian males between 45 and 65, and that's the Corvette demographic or whatever it is, right? Then I make that thing that targets that demographic, and I go into the ad ecosystem and I can start buying indicators. Like, oh yeah, these are the kind of people I want to go after. It's way easier than trying to profile a company and go spearfish. I put a lot of effort into trying to make one real legitimate spearfish, copy a cab receipt or a limo receipt, or I can go to the ad network and buy like 1,000 of those at a fraction of the price, and go after those people. So what is malvertising? It's a very fast growing threat area that leverages our software by inserting attacks into third-party components that run on our applications, predominantly our web applications. It's fairly poorly understood, and part of it is the complexity of the ad world online today. It took a while just to get my head around it. And there's so many different pieces and actors, as I'll show you later. It's really hard to police, because the minute you point at someone and say, hey, you're accountable, they're like, well, what about this? I bought this from this, and I get this from this, and they all start pointing the fingers at each other. And then if one person does decide to try to lock something down, the bad guy just jumps ship over to the next piece of the chain. And this will make more sense later. I'll show you the layout of the whole chain. So we saw from into 2014, so we started gathering this data late 2014, and through last year we saw about a 250% uptick in attacks coming through legitimate destinations and portals leveraging ad networks. I mean, even Tesla was breached last year, Tesla Motors. So attackers have gotten away with substantial amounts of money and data. We've gotten into the 8 figures that we've seen in campaigns. So it's very lucrative. That's why they come there. We don't really, as orgs today, defensively, we don't have great tools to measure and monitor this. We could be serving this stuff up and have no idea as an organization. What's happening, though, is now that the endpoint vendors are getting a little more sophisticated at detecting this sort of thing, where it usually bites organizations and they start dealing with it is when they lose customers, because usually what happens is endpoints get triggered and block them from using that piece of software. And this is really important in transactionally competitive type of software like in retail, because then they'll just pop over to another retailer. And in fact, if they think you're an untrusted destination, they may not come back. So if you're a bank, they're probably not going to break off their relationship with you permanently. They're probably going to get on the phone and call customer service or something like that, slightly different. If you're a retailer or you have a lot of competition with a low barrier to entry to sign up and use it, you're probably going to lose that person for life if an endpoint tells them that you're attacking them. So it got enough attention. The U.S. Senate Committee for Homeland Security did a big subcommittee last year on this. So you all work with internet software, probably don't have to really beat this to death, but the infrastructure we built was built for efficiency. It was built for range and scale of cheap distribution. Security was not a consideration for this. There's no regulation in the online advertising industry for the most part, so even regulatory checklist concerns aren't really a part. These ad delivery networks can, once you sell them real estate, they essentially own that real estate in your application, and they can do whatever they want to it at any given point in time. You might have contractual agreements with them that restrict what they're allowed to do, what they can size, what they can place, but the reality is the old adage, if your adversary can run code on your computer that's not your computer anymore, well, in this case, she's running code in all your users' browsers. So it's not your user experience anymore if she chooses to do something differently than you would prefer. So the size of this industry is pretty interesting. This is something that's you kind of live and breathe it when you spend too much time out in Silicon Valley. But honestly, when I lived here, I didn't think as much about the nature of a lot of the apps that we use that are free. You probably all heard the adage by now, but if it's, if the product you're using, Gmail, Yahoo Mail, whatever it is, if it's free, you're the product, right? So everything's collected and traded. Google's one of the most sophisticated at this, and there's a lot of money. I mean, basically everything free today is we are the products, and they're buying and selling data on us. And this is important because our adversaries have figured out that these people are collecting and buying and selling data on us. It's a gold mine to profile and go after us. So you can see the size of the market here. It's pretty amazing. I just, maybe I was naive, but I didn't understand until we got into studying this about a year and a half ago how big this was. But today it's a $545 billion market. You can see pretty quickly here, this year we'll be breaking the $600 million mark. So there's a lot of money that's tied up in this. Policing and shutting these down and restricting them is a direct impact to that revenue. So there's not a lot of incentive to try to throw in sandbags and put the brakes on, especially when you got $600 billion flowing through a fairly complex infrastructure. So what did we find as a result of monitoring to see what kind of attacks? Well, the number one thing that we found was fake branded software. People try to get you to download some fake branded version of Photoshop, some fake mobile app. The thing, that Eurograbber that I mentioned earlier, they made $47 million. They essentially set up like a mint.com in Europe and Eastern Europe. They essentially created a faux aggregator app. And then ran it legitimately until they got enough critical mass of users, and then they took a lot of money and disappeared. And 47 million is pretty good. Makes me question my career choice. But the fake branded software was the number one thing we found. Is people click on it and download it, and they use the ad networks, the best, easiest way to distribute it, especially if they can find cookies and things that indicate you've visited this or that vendor, then they know exactly what to target it with. Number two is just generic software. And that's where they don't even try to profile you. They just prompt a random drive-by download, save as dialog box. That was number two that we found. Number three, and this is off of last year's data, our newest data that we'll be publishing later this year, I think number three might have become number one. For sure it's probably going to be number two. Fake antivirus software was number three from what we found 2014 through 2015. But we've seen a huge upsurge in fake AV software. And then actually you've got, Malwarebytes and AVG and Avast. They have kind of interesting business models themselves. You've got a legitimate AV vendors that kind of operate in a very questionably legitimate way in how they, have any of you gotten calls from them at your organizations? Okay, well hopefully you don't get to experience that. Those organizations try a lot of ways to. What's that?
I just get calls from Microsoft wanting me to.
Well, there's legitimate orgs that also use these networks to distribute legitimate software in hopes that your end users will do it, and then they wait till your end users connect from your internal networks, and then they call up. They just bypass IT and go to the CFO and say, hey, you're in violation of our EULA. By running this software, we need to true up with you. We won't go to court if we just settle this way. So anyway, the legitimate software is also using this to make money. And then Angler and Rig are the two main exploit kits where things get sophisticated. But if we didn't even put them on the graph here to give you an idea. So when we graphed it out, I thought that the really sophisticated exploity stuff would be up there high, and it wasn't at all. The reason we didn't show it on the graph is you literally just can't see it in any graph we can represent the degree of differentiation between exploit kits versus fake software. So brand impersonation, we call it rogue applications. I think you get the idea that you're cruising along and you'll get something and it'll have some keywords and some logo, and most common one will be an update. It'll say like your Adobe Photoshop is out of date, you're at risk, please download the newest security patch. This is what I mean by generic Trojan. You just literally, you're going along and it's like, oh hey, save or run the file. Fake AV, I'm sure we've all seen this. Hopefully you're running no script and some ad blockers. Angler was interesting to me, mainly because it was like the only one that still supports Silverlight, which very dead technology. But Angler, so the exploit kits out there, they'll support multi-frameworks. What's interesting about them is they'll actually do some fingerprinting. So they use a lot of techniques that Google and some of the other vendors do to figure out who you are in properties. So like, I run multiple browser instances and isolate how I run different apps. In some cases I'll run different types of browsers, but it's all kind of an exercise in futility because, the last I knew what Google was tracking, they had 32 different primary data points that they tracked about you, from screen resolution to anything they could fingerprint to detect what types of software, basically to essentially profile your machine. And once you have one authentication, regardless of how you try to change that, they have all these other correlation points to go, oh, that's this person and their devices. Well, that's essentially what they're doing with this, and that way so they can launch very targeted, high odds of success exploits. They don't want to fire off a panoply of things that might trigger an endpoint or a network sensor that attacks are going on. So they want to fire one very targeted dart that has a high odds of success. So they tickle and fingerprint, figure out what's exploitable. In the case of Angler, it's actually got a bunch of essentially JavaScript files that run and do these triggers and different fingerprints, and they look for specifics for everything from kernel files to other files for AV and this sorts. If it finds things of like active AV or detection mechanisms, it'll abort its whole attempt if it finds something that it thinks can detect it. So for us to detect it, we have to run a real browser that behaves like a real user and not do anything to give them indication that we're actually security people looking for them. And then RIG is the second most common exploit kit. And the interesting thing about RIG is that it's offered essentially as a SaaS service. So you actually don't have to go deploy it and set it up and host it. You can go pay by the hour or the week or the traffic to get someone else to host that for you and just link it in and run your exploits. And it does some of the same things. So like if it detects Kaspersky, Kaspersky was one of the first to detect RIG. RIG seems to come out of the Eastern Europe bloc. Kaspersky's there too. Don't know who wrote RIG, but if RIG detects Kaspersky, it shuts itself down. So those are the 5 main threats that we found. And again, these would all be served up through your website, through the ad network. Now, how did they get there? This is where it gets interesting. This is what your basic ad ecosystem looks like. This is why it's so tricky, and this is why most security people try to stay away from it. You start over on the left, you have advertisers, and then you have agencies. Those are the people who make creative. So advertisers could be a number of people. This over here could be someone in your organization, someone in marketing team. And then they go to the agencies, and the agencies build the creatives. That's a little graphic thing, for example, that you might host. Agencies offer a wide variety of services. Like most agencies out there today have teams that will build and host anything on WordPress. Well, they'll build it, and then you'll have option creative, option build and deploy creative, have a whole package bundle, build, deploy, and host it for you. And that's how we get a lot of shadow IT distributed all over the place. So you go to the agencies then, and they'll get tied into the demand side platform. So these are the 2 key things. So this says I want to put ads somewhere. And you can buy information about the type of platform, and ultimately it comes down to the type of user. If I'm running an ad, if you, I don't know, do you like Corvettes?
Not really.
Okay, I don't really want to show you a Corvette ad, right? What do you like? What's something you would buy if you, what would you click on if you saw it pop up in an ad? Besides, like, win free money.
Yeah, short of win free money.
So win
kind of
free-
been desensitized to clicking on ads.
Okay, so if I wanted to give away free money, we'd want to target you.
Yeah.
So we come in, and that's what the demand side platform is about, figuring out who those people are who want to win free money. It's probably a pretty big group. The exchanges are who broker this between the supply side. So when we get over here, publishers, this would be your organizations if you're serving up ads, essentially. Audiences, obviously, these are the people running the browsers. So the publishers, this is where the thing actually gets published out to the site. And you have ad servers. There are also publisher networks. So you might publish your own ads. Some people do that and tightly control them. You might buy from other publishers, or not buy, you might sell. Other publishers will pay you to put the ads on. If you're running it through that, there'll be a separate ad server that's hosted off of. And essentially, it's like renting out real estate. Think of it as like a campground. You know, some people might rent a slot for a week. Some people might get it for a day. Some people just might come there for the night to sleep over or do some kind of party. You have all this real estate. Every slot on your site where you have an ad will go through this network, and you have a mix of people saying, hey, I want to be on that site. I want to be on the New York Times, and I want this demographic. Or at the last minute, your business might have it set up. Let's say nobody buys that real estate. Let's say you got a campsite, and all of a sudden you got 75% of your campgrounds, the weekend's approaching, and nobody's booked them. And so the way it works then is that it just kind of opens it up and says, hey, we've got this kind of real estate. Does anybody want it? It'd be like setting up signs along the side of the road where all the holiday tourists are just driving by saying, hey, okay, 50% off, 75% off. Okay, a penny a campground. Do you want to stay here tonight? And so that's how that works. Well, what makes this cool is the adversaries can actually go into any piece of this. So each piece of this will start blaming the others, and it's hard to see. So adversaries can come in here. They could come in, they could start buying over here. This is going to be a little more expensive, but it's going to be a lot richer and more targeted. I want to target the specific demographic, specific people. I might have a little less control over here, but it's way cheaper. I can buy real estate for pennies on the dollar. You know, on my attacks then, I'm going to buy a lot of real estate, and it's more like hunting with a shotgun versus, you know, over here I'm going to hunt with an expensive sniper rifle round. Here I'm just pumping pellets out on the internet and hope I catch some victims that I'm after. And obviously the money flows this way through here. So your organization ultimately wants to get the money for these advertising that's pumped in all through here. Bad guys can also pop in over here and buy some interesting information, demographic data, maybe some info about tracking cookies, and then they can pop in over here. And they can pop in here with that information that helps them with the profiling. We also saw last year a number of cases where some pretty big advertising networks would have their ad servers compromised. So when badness shows up in here, the first thing you got to try to figure out is, where in the heck did it enter? Did they compromise the web server? Did they buy stuff that the publishers had opened up to the general public to auction? Did they buy specific targeted things pretending to be a legitimate agency? Is a legitimate agency doing shady things? So a couple examples and then we'll end here. Has anybody not heard of Browser Locker in the room? Awesome, we can skip this. Okay, we all know what Browser Locker is by now. So TDSs. TDS is Traffic Direction Service. This is the final piece in the game, or how the adversaries make it hard to figure out how something bad got on your site. So essentially over here you have, your site would be the compromised site if you start serving up the malware. They'll have their SEO, traffic manipulation. So we had a major bank that got compromised recently, and they compromised some of their external hosted web presences, including their primary brand presence. And what they did was they set up pieces of it to essentially host different types of content on the site, but not directly linked. So scanners, malware scanners, would not find a direct link on the home landing page of this particular banking site. But all the links were buried and embedded in there, and they were under the primary domain. And the reason why is then they could do SEO manipulations to drive traffic there, because Google PageRank and Bing Search Engine Index go, oh wait, this is one of the largest banks on the planet. It's highly trusted. They've never served up anything phony. Now there's all this cross-link content on there. So all this malware that was being distributed, once they got their hooks in, they used SEO to promote these links and get them. The first thing you do when you went to a search engine, if you put in the name of that bank, is you would get all this malicious content, like direct links to send you right into the attack itself. So anyway, think of this as the front end. Then this is the back end. So these are their databases. These are going to host the exploit kits and the files. And in the middle, this is like the business logic. This is like your asynchronous message queues and your business logic servers, your Java app servers, but it's a TDS. So, and the TDSs, by the way, they'll actually set up fairly complex policies on how to filter and reroute traffic. So I'll give you a quick example here. Here's a simple 4-stage TDS. And so they have an index page file. You know, so this is what the first thing you'd see called in through an ad, or it could be just a straight up compromise at your site, and they put in a link like the example I just gave you on there. So they compromise your site directly, or they come in through the ad network, and then that thing is going to load up this. And this is a redirector, and it then loads up an iframe redirector, and then that thing has an iframe rotator in it. And so a couple different things are going to happen. First, at a minimum, all these folks tend to route through a lot of different places to try to get ad revenue. So the first thing they try to do is monetize it. And then after they rotate through a lot of things to monetize it, which has the added benefit of obfuscating where the source of it is, then their final destinations they'll pipe you to is what's going to attempt to drop exploits on your employees or your customers and get their machine. So the example we use here is video ad banner, and we figured out, we're able to track back that they'd been compromised for quite a long time. And then so this was a legitimate ad network that the adversaries went into and compromised and started setting up their infrastructure strictly for the purpose of eventually distributing these attacks. They'll take their time and build out all this infrastructure. And so domains are registered through multiple registrars. So the adversaries start buying up these domains and then associating them, pointing them to these networks. They also start setting up all their payload servers. They'll use multiple hosting providers. So this is like the reverse of defense in depth. Actually, I take it back. This is literally defense in depth for the adversaries. The adversary threat infrastructure they're setting up, they're layering out and distributing it across multiple ecosystems to make it extremely hard for you to be able to find and take it down in one shot. Sort of privacy protection, so they do privacy registrations through a lot of the registrars. If you know people with ISPs, there's ways around that. Otherwise, it can obfuscate. So what did we find? Well, we wound up finding all 35 FQDNs involved in this threat infrastructure. We found, luckily there's some registrations without privacy protections. We were able to mine out related domains. On the Whois index, we're only able to get 10 records. So here's one thing that the adversaries still do that's a little goofy. They'll use the same domain name. So, you know, we might know who, you know, Chen Shu is, you know, or bill@gmail.com. But when we see bill@gmail.com has registered this domain that's has been launching this known bad stuff, and we see Bill's registered 10 other domains, it's usually pretty interesting. So we start pivoting around and going and look at those. So Whois only gave us a little bit, but then when we actually went through registrar contacts, we were able to find hundreds more registrations. So Bill was a busy beaver. He was setting up all this stuff. And what we've really learned, the biggest thing we've learned about adversaries in the last year is, again, this technology we've built has enabled them to spool up as quickly and easily and cheaply their adversarial infrastructure as it is for us. So it's no longer finding the one server in Russia and blocking it or taking it down, because they've got 100 more, and they've built out all their infrastructure. I say slowly, it's pretty quickly today, but they take their time and set it up, and then they rotate around through it. And I mean, if you kill one, they've got 99 more running, and they constantly rotate around through these as well, as I'm going to show you, because that also makes it hard. You know, the server that attacked you today, by the time you're researching it tomorrow, maybe offline, maybe back online the end of the week. And so you go to that thing and it's a dead end because they're running a few more and they keep rotating through them. So here's an example. So all these IPs were tied back in. They're all going to different registrars. So all of these were involved in the attack. And here's how a chain would look from this. So in this case, this particular attack was launched through the Huffington Post. And so from Huffington Post, then it goes to Yahoo. So this is a short chain. These chains can go on much longer. But you see we've got Huffington Post loads this up. And then we get this little click thing that pops in. And then what do? We go over to S3. And then from S3, we bounce around. From S3, we go to AWS. We're not going to block S3. We're not going to block AWS. And so they bounce us around inside there with iframes, and they can route you through a dozen times or more if they want to. They'll make it really complicated. And then they start pumping you through the TDS. By the time this thing loads, it's going to be popping up things through the monetary TDS network. And so you might get the click here to clean your registry, that sort of thing. They're popping you through that iframe rotator I pointed out. They'll pop through a whole bunch of URLs to just spam some ads just to see You know, it's again, this would be the shotgun style attack. If you click on anything, they make a few pennies or a few bucks. And eventually you wind up here at this unintelligible sequence that's probably dynamically generated, and this is what's going to drop its payload. If we decide that you're not looking for them, if you're not a hunter or a security scanner, if you're a real user with a vulnerable browser, we'll drop our payload. And then this thing might be gone in a day. It might go temporary offline and come back. They might rotate through 100 of these through the course of their campaign over the next 24 hours to make it really difficult to track them down. And so here's just an example of some of the S3 nodes and EC2 instances that were used in there. So they're very benign looking. Looks like totally normal destinations. This also, when I mentioned domain shadowing, this is what I was talking about. Even the good guys now, someone in your organization might have an app that still links into something from here or calls something in an application, and then you let this thing expire, or someone else gets control of the content on the particular Amazon host for that. We've seen cases where people will spool up and launch different content there. I mentioned the ads, like as they route you through the TDS, as that iframe rotator calls in different URLs, that's where you get this kind of random stuff they're hoping to make a few bucks off of. And this is the end of the, what is this? This was, oh, so here's another example of just strictly the monetization. So this one is using a slightly different TDS, and that it was called as image reference. So I don't know how this got in, but this actually got into Last.fm. So somebody got into Last.fm and managed to get this thing in, which is another Amazon AWS instance that just had a rotator that goes through our friends at Yahoo and then onto a whole bunch of different ad network TDSs. And again, this one was benign, but once you have this stuff running inside your applications, you have no control over it. So it can easily be dynamically routed at any given time to a malicious payload, and we don't really have any control over that. Or a bad guy can come along and subvert these things, as we saw the case with the video banner network. So this was legitimate, and then it gets subverted and goes bad, and that's how people wind up serving that up. A lot of information, short amount of time, late in the evening. Hope that wasn't too boring. Thank you all for coming. Any questions about that? So I have a question if there's no questions. Anybody have any questions? Complaints?
Still processing.
Insults? Okay. In the future, you know, we're collecting a lot of more attack and adversarial data. You know, and this group, the purpose of this group is and should be focused on, you know, building secure code and the builder breaker kind of thing. Let us know though if there's anything around what adversaries are doing and how they're setting up their infrastructure, around social media, mobile. Probably mobile is not, it just isn't quite that sexy because the major attacks, it's just there's not enough critical mass. Social media is really interesting, but there's something around the web, mobile, social media, or just trends we're seeing. Like one of the newest things we've been tracking is, remember I mentioned finding the email? What is Bill doing? What else has he set up? You can go through who is and registrants. The newest thing we found that's been highly valuable has been SSL certs. So all the adversaries are using SSL certs now with their campaigns, and now we started tracking who's registering what SSL certs and using them as part of our pivot points. So if there's any info like that that would be useful to understand what adversaries are setting up and how they're targeting your orgs, let us know. We'd be happy to share it. But I think overall this forum is probably a little more focused on the secure coding side of the SDLC. So thank you again. Hope this was informative for you. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks a lot, Aaron. Thanks very much to everybody for making it out. If anybody wants to join us for a beer at Mike's Tavern down on Troost afterwards, feel free to come along.